Ongoing allied groups. UWSP, UWSA Northern Alliance Federal Union Army Tatmadaw 492,000 Narbi. 21,500 to 26,500 plus approximately 10,000 unknown numbers of various other groups, bombings and attacks, protests and government changes, anti-Muslim violence. The internal conflict in Myanmar is a series of insurgencies in Myanmar that began shortly after the country, then known as Burma, gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1948. The conflict has largely been ethnic-based, with several ethnic armed groups fighting Myanmar's armed forces, the Tatmadaw, for self-determination. Despite numerous ceasefires and the creation of autonomous self-administered zones in 2008, many groups continue to call for independence, increased autonomy, or the federalization of the country. The conflict is also the world's longest ongoing civil war, having spanned more than 7 decades. Before Myanmar, and armed ethnic groups began to emerge in opposition to both the British and Japanese. In 1947, the Punlong Agreement was reached between Aung San and ethnic leaders, in an attempt to quell hostilities. However, the agreement was not honored by the post-independence government following Aung San's assassination, leading to further ethnic tensions. On 4 January 1948, Myanmar gained independence from the United Kingdom. The communists and ethnic minorities in the country were dissatisfied with the newly formed government, believing that they were being unfairly excluded from governing the country. 3 months after independence, the communists began an armed insurgency against the government. Similarly, Karen insurgent groups began to fight for independence. In the early 1960s, the government refused to adopt a federal system, to the dismay of insurgent groups such as the CPB, who proposed adopting the system during peace talks. By the early 1980s, politically motivated armed insurgencies had largely disappeared, while ethnic-based insurgencies continued. Several insurgent groups have negotiated ceasefires and peace agreements with successive governments, which until political reforms between 2011 and 2015 had largely fallen apart. The nationwide ceasefire agreement was a landmark agreement signed between the government of Myanmar and 8 insurgent groups on 15 October 2015. 2 other insurgent groups later joined on 13 February 2018. The conflict is generally divided into 3 parts. Insurgencies during the post-independence period under parliamentary rule and now under the newly elected civilian government, following independence from the United Kingdom, the 2 largest opposition groups in Burma. The former had fought the British colonial government prior to independence. However, during the final days of the Japanese occupation of Burma in World War II, both groups helped the British fight against the Imperial Japanese Army. Initially there was calm during the transitional period after independence. But on 2 April 1948, the CPB fired the first shots of the conflict in Pukkongyi, Pagu region. During the post-independence period, the KNU favored an independent state, governed by the Karen people. The proposed state would have encompassed the territories of Karen State and Karenni State. In Lower Burma, the KNU has since shifted their focus from full independence to regional autonomy, under a federal system with fair Karen representation in the government. After 3 successive parliamentary governments governed Myanmar, the Tatmadaw, led by General Ne Win, enacted a coup d'etat in 1962, which ousted the parliamentary government and replaced it with a military junta. Accusations of severe human rights abuses and violations followed afterwards, and the cabinet of the parliamentary government and political leaders of ethnic minority groups were arrested and detained without trial. Around this period, other ethnic minority groups began forming larger rebel factions, such as the Kachin Independence Army, in response to the new government's refusal to adopt a federal government structure. In 1967, following China's initiation of the Cultural Revolution, violence broke out between local Burmese and overseas Chinese in Myanmar, culminating in anti-Chinese riots in Rangoon and other cities. The riots left many overseas Chinese dead and prompted China to begin openly supporting the Communist Party of Burma, both immediately after the coup and again in 1972. General Ne Win held peace talks with opposition forces. But both times they fell apart, partly due to General Ne Win's refusal to adopt a multi-party system. After negotiations failed, defectors from the Tatmadaw and ethnic insurgents walked back to their bases. With headlines across Myanmar famously reading, "They have gone back." Private property was confiscated by the government, and the Burmese Socialist Program Party was founded in 1974 to govern the country under a one-party system. Under General Ne Win's 26-year dictatorship, Myanmar became an isolated hermit kingdom and one of the